The beam of my flashlight cut through the inky darkness, illuminating a pair of wide, terrified eyes. In that moment, I realized I'd made a fatal mistake. But let me start from the beginning. It was just past midnight on a moonless Tuesday when the call came in. I'd been parked in my usual spot, a hidden turnout off Highway 16 where I could catch speeders and maybe grab a few winks between patrols. The radio crackled to life, startling me from a light doze. Dispatch to Unit 17, we've got a 1053 reported on Highway 16, mile marker 237. Can you respond? I keyed the mic, stifling a yawn. Unit 17 responding, ETA 10 minutes. As I pulled onto the empty highway, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in my gut. Mile marker 237 was smack in the middle of a 30-mile stretch of nothing. No exits, no rest stops, not even a billboard to break up the monotony of scrubby pines and rocky outcroppings. What were the odds of a breakdown in that exact spot? The night was unusually still. No wind, no wildlife sounds, just the purr of my engine and the crunch of tires on asphalt. My headlights caught the reflective paint of the mile markers as I ticked them off. 234, 235, 236. There it was. A dark sedan was pulled onto the narrow shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly. I slowed, positioning my cruiser at an angle behind it, standard procedure to protect the scene from oncoming traffic. Not that there was any at this hour. I sat for a moment, hand on my holster, studying the vehicle. It was an older model, maybe early 2000s, with tinted windows that obscured any view of the interior. The trunk looked to be sitting a bit low, like it was carrying a heavy load. Unit 17 to dispatch. I'm 10, 23 at the scene. Single vehicle, appears unoccupied. Running plates now. I rattled off the license plate number and waited for dispatch to run it. The radio hissed with static for a long moment before the response came. Unit 17, be advised. Vehicle is registered to a Sandra Mullins, 42 from Oak Ridge. No wants or warrants. Copy that, I replied, unclipping my seatbelt. I'm going to approach the vehicle. I stepped out into the cool night air, immediately missing the comfort of my climate-controlled cruiser. The only sounds were the tick-tick-tick of my cooling engine and the faint click of the sedan's hazard lights. I unholstered my flashlight, leaving my gun secured but unsnapped. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. This is the state police. Is anyone there? No response. I approached cautiously, sweeping my light across the vehicle's exterior. No visible damage, no flat tires. Nothing to indicate why it had stopped here. I reached the driver's side door and cupped my hands around my eyes, peering through the window. The interior was clean, almost spotless. A pale blue air freshener dangled from the rearview mirror. No purse, no phone, no sign of the driver. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Where was Sandra Mullins? I tried the door handle, locked. I moved to the passenger side, then checked the rear doors. All secured. Unit 17 to dispatch, I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Vehicle is unoccupied and locked, no sign of the driver, requesting backup for a search of the immediate area. Copy Unit 17. Be advised all other units are currently engaged. Nearest available backup is approximately 45 minutes out. How do you want to proceed? I cursed under my breath. Protocol said to wait for backup, but my gut was screaming that something was wrong. If Sandra Mullins was out there, injured or lost, every minute could count. I'm going to do a preliminary search of the immediate area, I decided. Have that backup en route and ping my location every 10 minutes. If I don't respond, send everyone. Understood, Unit 17. Be careful out there. I did one more circuit of the vehicle, this time noticing faint scuff marks in the dirt by the trunk. Could be nothing, or it could be signs of a struggle. I played my flashlight along the shoulder, looking for any sign of footprints leading away from the road. The beam caught something reflective about 20 yards ahead. I approached cautiously, hand now resting on my holstered weapon. It was a cell phone, screen cracked but still faintly glowing. I crouched down, careful not to touch it. That's when I noticed the drag marks in the loose gravel, leading towards a gap in the trees I hadn't seen before. Every instinct told me to go back to my cruiser and wait for backup, but if someone was hurt out there, I couldn't just sit and wait. I drew my weapon, holding it in my right hand while keeping my flashlight in my left. Police, I shouted towards the trees. If anyone's out there, call out now. Silence. I took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. The underbrush was thick, pulling at my uniform as I pushed through. The drag marks were clearer here, a distinct trail leading deeper into the darkness. I moved as quietly as I could, straining my ears for any sound. After about 50 yards, the trees opened into a small clearing. My flashlight beam caught something pale against the dark earth. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. It was a hand, a woman's hand half buried in the loose soil. "Oh, God," I whispered, bile rising in my throat. I'd seen my share of bodies in my 12 years on the force, but it never got easier. I keyed my radio. "Unit 17 to dispatch. I found a body. Send all available units and the coroner to my location." I waited for the acknowledgement, but only static answered. I tried again, my voice rising. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Nothing. Either I was out of range or something was interfering with the signal. I was on my own. I knew I should secure the scene and head back to my cruiser to call this in. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. I played my flashlight slowly across the clearing. That's when I saw the second drag trail, leading away from the half-buried body. This one was fresher, the disturbed earth still dark with moisture. And at the end of the trail, my blood turned to ice. A hand was reaching out from behind a fallen log, fingers twitching weakly. I rushed forward, all thoughts of protocol forgotten. As I rounded the log, my light fell on the face of a woman, her eyes wide with fear and pain. Blood matted her blonde hair, and her clothes were caked with dirt. "Ma'am, I'm with the state police," I said, kneeling beside her. "Are you Sandra Mullins?" She nodded weakly, her lips moving but no sound coming out. I holstered my weapon and reached for my radio before remembering it was useless out here. "It's going to be okay," I assured her, though I felt anything but certain. "Can you tell me what happened? Who did this to you?" Sandra's eyes grew even wider. She wasn't looking at me anymore, but at something behind me. I started to turn, but too late. Pain exploded in the back of my skull. My vision swam, flashlight tumbling from nerveless fingers. As consciousness faded, I caught a glimpse of work boots and heard a deep, satisfied chuckle. I came to gradually, my head throbbing in time with my pulse. I was lying on my side, the taste of dirt and blood in my mouth. I tried to move, but my hands were bound behind my back. Panic flared, but I forced it down. Focus. Assess the situation. I was still in the clearing. I could make out Sandra's pale form a few feet away, illuminated by my flashlight. It was propped against a tree, casting long shadows across the ground. And there, silhouetted in its beam, was a man. He was big, easily 6'4", and solidly built. In one hand he held a shovel, the other gripped my service weapon. "Wakey, wakey, officer," he said, his tone almost jovial. "Glad you could join us. Wouldn't be sporting to start without you." I tried to speak, but my mouth was too dry. I swallowed hard and managed to croak out, "Who are you?" He laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Does it matter? I'm just a humble road worker, keeping our highways safe." He gestured with the shovel, dealing with objects that don't belong, burying problems. My mind raced. A highway worker would explain how he knew this isolated spot, how he could grab victims without raising suspicion. How many others had there been? "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You don't want to do this. Killing a cop will bring heat like you can't imagine. But if you let us go now, we can work something out." "Work something out?" He stepped closer, and I could finally see his face. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that might have been called kind in another context. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, officer, I've got a job to do. Can't leave it half-finished." He moved to Sandra, prodding her with the shovel. She whimpered, curling into herself. "Please," I said, struggling against my bonds. "She needs medical attention. Let me call this in, and I swear I'll tell them you were long gone when I got here." The man paused, tilting his head as if considering my words. For a moment I dared to hope. Then he smiled, revealing 2 white teeth. "That's mighty generous of you, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline." He raised the shovel high. "I've got my routine, you see, and I hate to break routine." As the shovel descended, I closed my eyes, unable to watch. The sound that followed would haunt me for the rest of my life, however long that might be. When I opened my eyes again, he was standing over me, my gun pointed at my face. And in that moment, staring down the barrel of my own weapon, I realized the fatal mistake I'd made in coming out here alone. The beam of my flashlight cut through the inky darkness, illuminating a pair of wide, terrified eyes, my own, reflected in the polished shovel blade as it arced towards my skull. Story 2. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie red glow across the cracked pavement. Vacancy, it proclaimed, though I wondered if we'd be better off sleeping in the car. But after 12 hours on the road, even this rundown motel looked like paradise. "What do you think, babe?" I asked, glancing at Sarah in the passenger seat. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, her blonde hair disheveled from the long drive. She shrugged, a weak smile playing on her lips. "Beggars can't be choosers, right? As long as the bed doesn't have bed bugs, I'm game it." I nodded, killing the engine. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of insects and the distant rumble of trucks on the highway. We grabbed our overnight bags and made our way to the office, our footsteps crunching on the gravel. The bell above the door jangled as we entered, startling the ancient clerk behind the counter. He peered at us through thick glasses, his rheumy eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Room for the night," I said, fishing out my wallet. He grunted, pushing a yellowed registration card towards me. "Cash only, $60. I raised an eyebrow at the price, but didn't argue. It wasn't worth the effort. I filled out the form and handed over 3 crumpled 20s, receiving a rusted key in return. "Room 13, the clerk mumbled. "End of the row." Sarah and I exchanged a look. Of course it would be room 13. The cool night air hit us as we stepped outside, carrying with it the scent of diesel and something else, something rank and unpleasant that I couldn't quite place. I wrinkled my nose but said nothing, not wanting to worry Sarah. Our room was at the far end of the motel, isolated from the few other occupied units. The key stuck in the lock, requiring some jiggling before the door finally swung open with a protesting creak. The smell hit us first, a cloying, fishy odor that made my stomach turn. Sarah gagged, covering her nose with her hand. "Oh, God," she muttered. "What is that?" I fumbled for the light switch, flooding the room with harsh fluorescent light. The decor was straight out of the 1970s. Faded floral wallpaper, a garish orange bedspread, and a battered TV that probably still had rabbit ears. But it was the bathroom that drew my attention. The door was ajar, and the odor seemed to be emanating from there. "Maybe there's a dead rat in the walls," I suggested, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'll check it out. Why don't you get settled?" Sarah nodded, still looking queasy. I steeled myself and pushed open the bathroom door. The smell intensified, but a quick scan revealed nothing obviously amiss. The fixtures were old and stained, but there was no sign of vermin or anything else that might account for the odor. I ran the tap, letting it flow for a minute in hopes of clearing any stagnant water in the pipes. The smell lessened slightly, so I decided to leave the door open to air things out. When I returned to the main room, Sarah was examining the back of the door with a frown. "Mike, look at this," she said, pointing to a series of deep scratches in the wood. I ran my fingers over the marks. They were recent. The wood still light where it had been gouged. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were at about shoulder height, as if someone had been clawing at the door from the inside. "Probably just some kid goofing around," I said, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. Sarah didn't look convinced, but she was too tired to argue. We went through our nightly routine in silence, the unfamiliar surroundings and lingering smell keeping us on edge. By the time we crawled into bed, my skin was crawling with an inexplicable sense of dread. "We'll be out of here first thing in the morning," I promised, pulling Sarah close. She nodded against my chest, her body gradually relaxing as exhaustion won out over discomfort. I don't know how long I slept before the noise woke me. At first I thought it was part of a dream, a soft, persistent scratching that wormed its way into my subconscious. But as I surfaced from sleep, I realized the sound was real. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black, the only illumination coming from the dim glow of the alarm clock. 3:17 a.m. The scratching continued, and now I could pinpoint its source, the door. Something was on the other side, its nails or claws scraping against the wood in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I held my breath, straining my ears. Was it an animal? A raccoon maybe, or a stray dog? But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. The scratching was too controlled, too purposeful. Sarah stirred beside me, her voice thick with sleep. "Mike?" What's that noise? Shh, I whispered, placing a hand on her arm. I don't know. Just stay still. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by an even more terrifying sound, the slow, deliberate turning of the doorknob. My blood ran cold. I had locked the door, hadn't I? I was sure I had. But as I watched in horror, the knob continued to rotate, metal scraping against metal in the silence of the room. Sarah's fingers dug into my arm, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but the words stuck in my throat. The door began to open, a sliver of darkness appearing between the frame and the edge. Whatever was on the other side was taking its time, savoring our fear. My mind raced, searching for options. The bathroom window was too small to climb through. We were trapped. Just as the gap widened enough for something to slip through, a truck roared past on the highway, its headlights briefly illuminating the room through the thin curtains. In that moment of clarity, I made a decision. I lunged for the bedside lamp, nearly knocking it over in my haste. Light flooded the room, momentarily blinding me. I blinked rapidly, my eyes fixed on the door. It was closed. I stared in disbelief, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Had I imagined it all? Mike, Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. What? What just happened? I shook my head, unable to form words. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, every muscle tense and ready to spring into action. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I approached the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, half expecting it to turn on its own again. But it remained motionless, cool metal against my sweaty palm. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open. The walkway outside was empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single overhead light. No shadowy figure, no monster, just the empty parking lot and the highway beyond. There's nothing there, I said, my voice shaky with relief. Sarah joined me at the door, wrapping her arms around herself. Are you sure you locked it earlier? I nodded emphatically. Positive, I always do. We stood there for a long moment, staring out into the night. The smell from earlier seemed to have intensified, wafting from somewhere nearby. I tried to locate its source, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. We should leave, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. I don't care if it's the middle of the night, I can't stay here. I nodded, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins, making the decision easy. Yeah, let's go. We can sleep in the car if we have to. We threw our belongings haphazardly into our bags, not bothering to change out of our pajamas. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see it start to open again. As Sarah zipped up her suitcase, a glint of something caught my eye. I moved closer to the bathroom, my heart rate picking up again. There, on the tile floor just inside the doorway, was a single long, curved nail. It was yellowed and thick, more like a claw than a human fingernail. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Mike, what is it? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with fear. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. It came from outside, somewhere close by, filled with terror and pain. We didn't hesitate. Grabbing our bags, we bolted from the room, not even bothering to close the door behind us. The night air hit us like a slap, shockingly cold after the stuffy confines of the motel room. The scream came again, this time cut off abruptly. It had come from one of the other rooms, but in the darkness it was impossible to tell which one. The car, I gasped, fumbling for the keys. We need to get out of here now. We sprinted across the parking lot, our bare feet slapping against the rough asphalt. I could hear doors opening, confused voices calling out, but I didn't stop to explain. As I jammed the key into the ignition, I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. A figure emerged from one of the rooms, hunched and misshapen. Even from a distance, I could see that its hands ended in long, curved claws. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, tires squealing as we peeled out of the parking lot. Sarah was sobbing beside me, her face buried in her hands. I didn't slow down until we were miles away, the lights of the motel long faded in the distance. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. What was that thing? Sarah asked between hiccuping breaths. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent answer. The image of those claws, the lingering memory of that fishy smell, the sound of the screams. It all swirled in my mind, refusing to coalesce into anything that made sense. I don't know. I finally managed. And I don't want to know. Let's just keep driving. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. But the nail marks on my palms where I had clenched the steering wheel told a different story. We never spoke about that night again, but sometimes when I catch a whiff of that fishy smell or hear the sound of scratching in the night, I'm right back in that motel room, waiting in terror for the door to open. Story 3. The crunch of gravel under our tires was the only sound for miles. That and the faint whisper of wind across the empty plains. We should have known better than to take this shortcut. "Hey, Matt, you see that?" Jake's voice cut through the silence, his finger pointing to a pinprick of light in the distance. "Please tell me that's a gas station." I squinted, trying to make out any details in the gathering dusk. God, I hope so. We're running on fumes here. We'd been on the road for hours, taking back roads and state highways on our way to Jake's sister's wedding in Colorado. It was supposed to be an adventure, a last hurrah before real life took over after college graduation. But now, with our gas gauge hovering dangerously close to empty and no cell service for the last 50 miles, the romance of the open road was wearing thin. As we approached, the lonely light resolved itself into a small gas station, its weathered sign proclaiming, "Last stop for 100 miles" in faded red letters. The place looked like it had seen better days, with rust creeping up the sides of the ancient pumps and weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete. "Beggars can't be choosers," I muttered, pulling up to the nearest pump. The station's single fluorescent light flickered ominously, casting strange shadows across the empty lot. Jake climbed out, stretching his lanky frame. "I'll go see if they've got any snacks. Want anything?" I shook my head, focusing on filling up the tank. As the numbers on the pump slowly ticked upward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the distant rumble of thunder. The bell above the station's door jingled as Jake disappeared inside. I finished filling up and replaced the nozzle, glancing around uneasily. That's when I noticed the truck. It was parked on the far side of the lot, half hidden in shadows. A big rig, its once white paint now a dingy gray. There was no sign of a driver, but I could have sworn I saw movement in the cab. Jake's voice made me jump. "Dude, you've got to hear this." He was clutching a bag of chips and a couple of energy drinks, his eyes wide. I overheard the cashier talking to someone on the phone. They were discussing some kind of disappearances along this highway. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of disappearances?" Jake lowered his voice, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "Travelers mostly. People passing through who never made it to their destinations. The cashier said it's been happening for months, but the police can't find any leads." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Maybe we should get out of here." Jake nodded, already moving towards the passenger side. As I slid into the driver's seat, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The truck's headlights flicked on, momentarily blinding me. "Let's go," Jake urged, his earlier excitement replaced by nervous energy. I turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. As we pulled out of the station, I couldn't help but notice the truck hadn't moved. Its headlights bore into us, watching our departure with an unsettling intensity. For several minutes, we drove in tense silence, the only sound the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. The landscape outside was a blur of darkness, broken only by the faint glow of our headlights. "You think that stuff about the disappearances is true?" I asked, more to break the silence than anything else. Jake shrugged, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone as he unsuccessfully tried to get a signal. "I don't know, man, but did you see how nervous that cashier looked? Like he was afraid of saying too much." I was about to respond when a flicker of movement in the rearview mirror caught my attention, headlights growing larger by the second. "We've got company," I muttered, pressing down on the accelerator. Jake twisted in his seat, peering out the back window. "It's that truck from the gas station. How the hell did it catch up so fast?" The truck was gaining on us, its massive grille filling our rearview mirror. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead as I pushed our old sedan to its limits, the engine whining in protest. "Try to lose him," Jake urged, his knuckles white as he gripped the dashboard. I swerved onto a narrow side road, kicking up a cloud of dust. For a moment, I thought we'd lost our pursuer. Then the truck's headlights reappeared closer than ever. "What the fuck does this guy want?" I shouted, fear and adrenaline making my voice crack. Jake didn't answer. He was fumbling with his phone, desperately trying to call for help. "Still no signal," he growled in frustration. The truck was so close now I could see the silhouette of the driver, a dark shape behind the wheel. As I watched in horror, the truck suddenly swerved, its massive bumper clipping our rear fender. The impact sent us spinning. I fought for control, tires screeching as we fishtailed across the road. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought we were going to flip. Then miraculously, we straightened out. "Go, go, go!" Jake yelled, his eyes wild with fear. I didn't need to be told twice. I floored it, praying our battered car would hold together. But something was wrong. The steering felt off, and there was a worrying rattle coming from under the hood. "I think he damaged something," I said, struggling to keep us on the road. "We're losing power." Jake swore, twisting around to look behind us. "He's backing off. I think he's turning around." Sure enough, the truck's taillights were receding into the distance. But our relief was short-lived. As we limped along, the car's performance deteriorated rapidly. Steam began to billow from under the hood, and the engine made an ominous grinding noise. "We need to stop," I said, fighting to keep the panic out of my voice. "We're not going to make it much further like this." Jake nodded grimly. "Pull over there," he said, pointing to a small turnout ahead. I guided our wounded vehicle off the road, killing the engine as soon as we rolled to a stop. For a moment we sat in silence, the only sound our ragged breathing and the tick of the cooling engine. "What the hell just happened?" Jake finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to form a coherent answer. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle. "We need to check the damage. Maybe we can fix it enough to limp to the next town." The night air was cool on my flushed skin as I stepped out. Jake joined me, and together we made our way to the front of the car. Even in the dim light, I could see the extent of the damage. The rear fender was crumpled, and there was a worrying dent in the side panel. But it was the front that concerned me most. Steam hissed from a crack in the radiator, and there was a puddle of fluid forming beneath the car. "This isn't good," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. Jake was about to respond when a sound cut through the night. The low rumble of an approaching engine. We froze, exchanging panicked glances. "You don't think—" Jake began. But we both knew. The truck was coming back. "Get in the car," I hissed, already moving towards the driver's side. "We need to hide." We scrambled inside, ducking down low in our seats. Through the windshield, I could see the glow of headlights approaching. The rumble grew louder, and then the truck appeared, moving slowly along the road. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give us away. Beside me, Jake's breathing was shallow and quick. We watched in terrified silence as the truck crawled past our hiding spot. For a moment, I dared to hope it would continue on. But then the brake lights flared and the massive vehicle began to back up. "Oh, God," Jake whispered. "He's seen us." The truck came to a stop directly in front of our disabled car. Its headlights illuminated the interior, leaving us nowhere to hide. I heard the creak of a door opening, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. "What do we do?" Jake's voice was barely audible. I groped blindly in the darkness, my hand closing around the tire iron we kept under the seat. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "If he tries anything, we fight," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps grew closer. A shadow fell across the windshield. I gripped the tire iron tighter, my palms slick with sweat. There was a tap on the window. I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat. "You boys need some help." The voice was gruff, but not unkind. Cautiously, I raised my head. The man standing outside was older, his face weathered by years on the road. He didn't look threatening, but after what had just happened, I wasn't taking any chances. "We're fine," I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. "Just having some engine trouble." The man nodded, seemingly oblivious to our fear. "Saw you pull over, thought you might need a hand. It's not safe to be stranded out here, what with all the strange things happening lately." Jake and I exchanged glances. Could this really be a good Samaritan? Or was it all part of some elaborate trap? "You boys hear about the disappearances," the man continued, oblivious to our internal struggle. "Been a lot of folks going missing along this stretch. That's why I came back to check on you. Didn't want you to become the next victims." Slowly, the tension began to drain from my body. This wasn't our attacker. This was just a concerned trucker looking out for a couple of stranded travelers. We appreciate that, I said, finally lowering the tire iron. But why did you run us off the road earlier? The man's brow furrowed in confusion. Run you off the road, son? I just came from the opposite direction. This is the first time I've seen you tonight. A chill ran down my spine as the implications of his words sank in. If this wasn't the truck that had chased us, we need to get out of here, Jake said, voicing the thought we were both having. Now, the trucker nodded, seeming to sense our urgency. I can give you a tow to the next town. It's not far. As we hurriedly hitched our car to the trucker's rig, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Somewhere out in the darkness, our real pursuer was waiting, and I had a sinking feeling that our ordeal was far from over. Story 4. Here's the full story for idea number 5, written in first person with approximately 1,500 words. I never thought a glass of water could be so terrifying. But as I stared at the innocuous tumbler in the old woman's trembling hand, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The liquid inside was clear, inviting, and quite possibly my doom. It had started as just another delivery, one of dozens I'd make that day. The sun was setting as I guided my motorcycle down a winding country road, the weight of my courier bag a familiar comfort against my back. The address I'd been given was for a farmhouse miles from the nearest town. As the old two-story came into view, I felt a prickle of unease. The paint was peeling, the porch sagging, and overgrown weeds choked what might have once been a garden. But appearances could be deceiving, and I'd delivered to plenty of run-down places before. I parked my bike and retrieved the small package from my bag. As I approached the front door, I noticed all the ground floor windows had heavy bars installed. Odd for such a remote location, but maybe they'd had break-ins. I knocked, the sound echoing hollowly. For a long moment there was no response. I was about to knock again when I heard shuffling footsteps from inside. The door creaked open, revealing a tiny, wizened woman. She peered up at me through thick glasses, her roomy eyes magnified to owlish proportions. Yes? Her voice quavered, barely above a whisper. I smiled, holding out the package. Good evening, ma'am. Delivery for Edna Millbrook? Her face lit up. Oh, yes, I've been waiting for this. Come in, come in. She stepped back, gesturing for me to enter. I hesitated. Company policy was clear, never enter a customer's home. But the old woman looked so frail and the sun was nearly gone. What harm could it do? I really shouldn't, I began, but she cut me off with a surprising firmness in her voice. Nonsense. It's getting dark and you must be parched after that long ride. I insist you come in for a glass of water at least. Before I could protest further, she had taken my arm in a grip far stronger than I would have expected and all but pulled me inside. The door shut behind us with a decisive click. The interior of the house was dim, lit only by a few low-wattage bulbs. The air was thick with the musty smell of old books and something else I couldn't quite place. Dust motes danced in the fading sunlight that managed to penetrate the grime-covered windows. This way, dear, Edna said, leading me towards what I assumed was the kitchen. Let's get you that water. As we passed through the living room, I noticed more oddities. Every piece of furniture was pushed against the walls, leaving a large empty space in the center. The walls themselves were covered in a chaotic collage of newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and what looked like star charts. My unease grew. I needed to make an excuse and leave. Now. Actually, Mrs. Millbrook, I should really be going. I have other deliveries to make. She turned, fixing me with a stare that froze me in place. Don't be silly. You'll stay for water. It wasn't a request. We entered the kitchen and I had to stifle a gasp. Every surface was covered in bottles, jars, and containers of all shapes and sizes. Some held liquids of various colors, others powders or what looked like dried herbs. Labels and spidery handwriting adorned each one, but I couldn't make out the words. Edna busied herself at the sink, filling a glass from the tap. I stood awkwardly in the doorway, my hand instinctively going to my phone in my pocket. No signal. Of course. Here you are, dear, she said, turning and holding out the glass. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, which studied me with an unsettling intensity. I took the glass automatically but didn't drink. Thank you, Mrs. Millbrook. If you could just sign for the package, I'll be on my way." She tilted her head, reminding me unnervingly of a bird eyeing its prey. "But you haven't had your water yet. It's rude to refuse hospitality, you know." I glanced down at the glass in my hand, then back at Edna. In the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen, I noticed things I'd missed before. The numerous small scars on her hands, the faint chemical smell underlying the musty odor of the house, the way her eyes kept darting to the cellar door behind me. My heart began to race. I set the glass down on the nearest clear surface. "I'm sorry, but I really must be going. If you could just sign—" "I'm afraid I can't let you leave." The quaver was gone from her voice, replaced by a cold steel that sent chills down my spine. "You see, I've been waiting for someone like you, young, strong, perfect for my work." She took a step towards me. I backed up, my heel hitting the first step down to the cellar. Panic clawed at my throat. "What work? What are you talking about?" Edna's face split into a grin, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp. "Why, the great work, of course. The alchemical transformation. I'm so close to cracking the code of immortality, but I need fresh subjects. The last one, well, he didn't last as long as I'd hoped." My blood ran cold. I turned to run, but my foot slipped on the cellar step. I went down hard, my head cracking against the doorframe. Stars exploded in my vision. Through the haze of pain, I saw Edna approaching, that terrible smile still on her face. "Don't fight it, dear. It'll be so much easier if you don't fight." I tried to get up, but my limbs felt like lead. Had I hit my head that hard? Or— I looked at the glass of water, still sitting untouched where I'd left it. She'd planned this from the moment she opened the door. "Why?" I managed to croak out. "Why me?" Edna knelt beside me, her face softening into an almost motherly expression. "Oh, my dear, it's nothing personal, but when you've lived as long as I have, you learn to take the opportunities fate provides, and you were kind enough to walk right into my home." She produced a syringe from somewhere in her cardigan. I tried to move, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. The needle slid into my arm with practiced ease. "Don't worry," Edna cooed as darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision. "If my calculations are correct, you won't feel a thing. And if they're not, well, your sacrifice will bring me one step closer to perfection." The last thing I saw before consciousness fled was Edna's face, those magnified eyes staring down at me with a mixture of scientific curiosity and hunger. I awoke to the sound of dripping water and the acrid smell of chemicals. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came flooding back. The delivery, the old woman, the syringe, and I jerked fully awake with a gasp. I was strapped to some kind of table, the cold metal pressing against my back. Heavy leather restraints bound my wrists and ankles. The room, the cellar, I realized, was dimly lit by a single bare bulb swinging gently overhead. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. I turned my head, taking in as much of my surroundings as I could. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, stretching off into shadows my eyes couldn't penetrate. Closest to me were tables covered in arcane-looking equipment, beakers, tubes, and devices I couldn't begin to identify. The walls were lined with shelves holding more of the bottles and jars I'd seen in the kitchen. And there in the corner was a shape I desperately tried not to focus on, a human-sized mass covered by a stained tarp. "Ah, you're awake." Edna's voice made me flinch. She stepped into view, now wearing a stained lab coat over her cardigan. "Excellent. I was worried I might have miscalculated the dosage." "Please," I croaked, my throat painfully dry. "Let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." She clucked her tongue, shaking her head. Now, don't be difficult. This is for the greater good, you know. Think of the advances we'll make, immortality just within our grasp." "We?" I asked, latching onto anything that might buy me time. "Are there others?" A shadow passed over Edna's face. "There were. Colleagues, rivals, but they lacked vision, you see. They were too squeamish, too bound by outdated ethics." Her expression hardened. "They tried to stop me, called me mad, but I showed them. Oh yes, I showed them all." She turned away, busying herself with something on one of the tables. I yanked at my restraints, but they held fast. "Mrs. Millbrook Edna," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't have to do this. Think about what you're saying. This isn't science, it's murder." She whirled back to face me, eyes flashing with anger. "Murder?" You dare call this murder? This is the culmination of centuries of research. The ancient alchemists knew the secret, but it was lost. I've spent lifetimes trying to recreate their work, and now, finally, I'm close. So very close. Edna leaned in close, her breath hot on my face. Do you know what it's like to watch everyone you've ever known wither and die? To see the world change around you while you remain unchanged? I've lived through plagues, wars, revolutions. I've seen empires rise and fall, and through it all, I've carried on my work. She straightened up, smoothing down her lab coat. But I'm tired, so very tired. This form, this mask of age, it's a necessity. People ask too many questions of a woman who never grows old. But soon, very soon, I'll be able to shed this disguise. To be young again, truly and permanently. I stared at her in horror, the full weight of her madness crashing down on me. This wasn't just some deranged old woman. This was something far older, far more dangerous. How? I swallowed hard, barely able to form the words. How many? How many people have you killed? Edna smiled, a dreamy look coming over her face. Oh, my dear, I stopped counting centuries ago. She turned back to her table, humming tunelessly as she began mixing chemicals. I renewed my struggles against the restraints, ignoring the pain as they cut into my wrists. Now then, Edna said, turning back to me with a syringe full of sickly green liquid. Let's begin, shall we? Try not to scream too much. It upsets the neighbors. As she approached, needle glinting in the harsh light, I closed my eyes and said a silent prayer. Not for rescue, I knew that wouldn't come, but for strength, and for whatever poor soul would be making their final delivery to this house of horrors after me. Story 5. The stench hit me before I even touched the bag. In 15 years of hauling trash, I'd smelled some foul things, but this was different. This was wrong. I should have left it there, should have called my supervisor. Instead, I reached for the bag and my world changed forever. It was a Tuesday, just after 4 a.m. The streets were empty. The only sound the rumble of my garbage truck as it inched down Oak Street. The amber glow of streetlights cast long shadows, making the familiar houses look alien and forbidding. I yawned, fighting the fatigue that always set in during these pre-dawn hours. 2 more streets and I could take my coffee break. The thought of hot, bitter liquid was the only thing keeping me going. The Petersons' house was coming up on my right. Nice folks, always remembered my name at Christmas. Their trash cans were at the curb as usual, but something caught my eye. Next to the normal bins was a large black garbage bag, the heavy-duty kind you get at hardware stores. I frowned. The Petersons were usually sticklers for the rules. No bags outside bins, recyclables properly sorted. This was out of character. As I approached, the smell hit me. At first, I thought maybe their dog had gotten into something rotten, but this was stronger, more pungent. It reminded me of the time I found a dead possum in my crawl space, but amplified 100 times. I should have just tossed it in the truck. That's what the company trained us to do. Don't investigate, don't open bags, just dump and go. But curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was the unusual nature of the bag, or perhaps some primal instinct warning me that something was off. I reached for the bag, and immediately I knew this was no ordinary trash. It was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. And there was something solid inside. Not the usual jumble of household waste, but a single large mass. My heart began to race. Part of me already knew what I'd find, but my conscious mind refused to acknowledge it. With trembling hands, I began to tear at the plastic. The smell intensified as I opened the bag, so strong it made my eyes water. I gagged, turning my head away for a moment. When I looked back, I saw a pale, lifeless hand protruding from the torn plastic. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not on my route, not in this quiet suburban neighborhood. I had to be imagining things. But as I stared, there was no denying the reality. The hand was attached to an arm, the arm to a shoulder. I could make out the curve of a head, hair matted with what I prayed was just mud, but knew in my heart was blood. My stomach heaved, and I barely made it to the gutter before losing what little I'd eaten that morning. As I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, my mind raced. What should I do? Call the police? My supervisor? Run? The decision was taken out of my hands by the sudden roar of an engine starting nearby. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. A car sat idling halfway down the block, its headlights off. In the dim glow of the streetlights, I could just make out the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat watching me. For a moment, we were frozen in a tableau, me standing over the torn garbage bag, the stranger in the car observing silently. Then, as if someone had pressed play on a paused movie, everything happened at once. The car's headlights flashed on, momentarily blinding me. I threw up an arm to shield my eyes, stumbling backward. The engine revved, tires squealing on the asphalt as the vehicle lurched forward. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the pavement as I sprinted towards my truck. I could hear the car behind me, engine roaring as it gave chase. I reached the truck, yanking open the door with such force I nearly pulled it off its hinges. I scrambled inside, fumbling with the keys. The car was getting closer, its headlights illuminating the cab of my truck. Finally, the engine sputtered to life. I threw the truck into gear, the transmission grinding in protest at the rough treatment. I stomped on the accelerator and the big vehicle lurched forward. In my side mirror, I could see the car swerve around my truck. For a moment, I thought they might try to cut me off, but instead they sped past, disappearing around the corner at the end of the street. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the truck on the road. I drove aimlessly, no destination in mind except away. My mind was a jumble of fragmented thoughts and images, the pale hand, the watching figure, the chase. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I pulled over in an empty parking lot. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps, and I realized I was on the verge of hyperventilating. I forced myself to take deep breaths, trying to calm the racing of my heart. What had I just witnessed? A murder, obviously, but who and why? The Petersons had always seemed so normal, so friendly. Could they really be capable of something like this? And what about the person in the car? Was it Mr. Peterson coming back to dispose of the evidence properly, or was it someone else entirely, the real killer perhaps, returning to the scene of the crime? I reached for my phone with trembling hands, ready to call 911. But as my finger hovered over the dial button, doubt crept in. What if I was wrong? What if there was some innocent explanation for all of this? I'd lose my job for sure, might even face legal consequences for going through someone's trash. But how could there be an innocent explanation for a body in a garbage bag? I was still wrestling with indecision when a sharp tap on my window nearly made me jump out of my skin. I whirled around to see a police officer standing outside my truck, flashlight in hand. My heart, which had just begun to slow, kicked into overdrive again. Had they already found the body? Were they here to arrest me? With shaking hands, I rolled down the window. The officer's face was impassive, giving nothing away. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp and assessing. "We got a call about a garbage truck driving erratically." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. What could I say? How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd experienced? Would he even believe me? The officer's expression shifted from neutral to concerned. "Sir, have you been drinking?" I shook my head vehemently. No, officer, I saw something on my route." His eyebrow raised slightly. "Saw something? Can you be more specific? This was it, the moment of truth. Do I tell him everything and risk being labeled a lunatic? Or do I keep quiet and let a potential murderer go free?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "There was a body," I blurted out. "In a garbage bag. Outside the Petersons' house on Oak Street." The officer's other eyebrow joined the first. "A body? Are you sure?" I nodded, the words now tumbling out in a rush. "I'm sure, I saw it. And then there was a car watching me and it chased me when I ran." I trailed off, realizing how insane I must sound. The officer was looking at me with a mixture of skepticism and concern. "All right, sir," he said slowly. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. We're going to take a little trip down to the station and you can tell us all about this body you saw." My heart sank. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. Who would? As I climbed down from the truck, legs wobbly, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe I should have just kept quiet, pretended I hadn't seen anything. But as the officer led me to his cruiser, a small part of me felt relieved. At least now someone else knew. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't have to carry this burden alone. As we drove towards the station, I couldn't help but glance in the side mirror, half expecting to see that mysterious car following us. The streets remained empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting. I didn't know what would happen when we reached the station. Would they believe my story? Would they find the body, or would it be gone, spirited away while I was driving aimlessly through the night? One thing was certain, my life would never be the same. In the space of an hour, my world had been turned upside down. The familiar streets of my route, once mundane and comforting, now seemed full of hidden dangers and dark secrets. As the police station came into view, I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. I would tell them everything, every detail I could remember. And then, maybe, just maybe, we could get to the bottom of this nightmare. Because one thing was clear, somewhere out there, a killer was free. And whether anyone believed me or not, I was now the only one who knew the truth. The weight of that knowledge settled on my shoulders like a physical burden, one I knew I'd carry for the rest of my life. The cruiser pulled into the station parking lot, and as the officer opened my door, I steeled myself for what was to come. Whatever happened next, I knew my days of being just another garbage man were over. For better or worse, I was now part of something much bigger, much darker. And somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, a killer was watching, waiting, planning their next move. Story 6. The radio crackled to life, breaking the monotony of my night shift. Dispatch to Unit 17, we've got an abandoned vehicle reported on Highway 61, mile marker 23. Can you check it out? I sighed, grateful for something to do but wary of what I might find. In my 15 years on the force, abandoned cars rarely meant anything good. 10-4 dispatch, Unit 17 en route. As I flicked on my cruiser's lights and pulled onto the empty highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a routine call. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the asphalt. It was the kind of night where the darkness seemed alive, hiding secrets just beyond the reach of my headlights. I spotted the car long before I reached it, a sleek black sedan, its hazard lights blinking feebly in the gloom. As I pulled up behind it, I noticed there were no tracks leading off the road, no signs of a struggle or accident. It was as if the car had simply materialized there, its occupants vanishing into thin air. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the cruiser. The cool night air carried the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and vaguely familiar. I approached the vehicle cautiously, my hand resting on my holstered weapon. "Hello? This is the state police. Is anyone there?" Silence answered me, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the hazard lights and the distant hoot of an owl. I circled the car, shining my light into the windows. The interior was immaculate, with no signs of disturbance, but something on the passenger seat caught my eye. A map, unfolded and marked with what looked like a red circle. I tried the door handle, surprised to find it unlocked. Leaning in, I grabbed the map, my eyes widening as I realized it wasn't a road map at all, but a topographical chart of the surrounding wilderness. A remote location deep in the forest was indeed circled in red ink, with no roads leading to it. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something else, a smear of what looked disconcertingly like blood on the edge of the paper. I straightened up, my mind racing. This was no ordinary abandoned vehicle. Something was very wrong here. I keyed my radio. "Unit 17 to dispatch. I'm going to need backup at my location. Possible 10-31. Copy that, Unit 17. Can you provide more details?" I was about to respond when a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam, I saw fresh tire tracks leading off the road and into the dense undergrowth. "Stand by, dispatch," I muttered, my heart rate quickening. I followed the tracks to the edge of the tree line where they disappeared into the darkness. The foliage was disturbed, branches broken and leaves crushed, forming a crude path into the woods. Every instinct told me to wait for backup. But what if someone was in trouble? What if every second counted? With a deep breath, I plunged into the forest, following the makeshift trail. The darkness closed in around me, the beam of my flashlight seeming pitifully inadequate against the pressing gloom. Branches clawed at my uniform, and unseen roots threatened to trip me with every step. I don't know how long I walked. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the suffocating blackness of the woods. But suddenly the trees thinned, and I found myself on the edge of a small clearing. What I saw there made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin. Its windows were dark, but a faint light flickered behind the drawn curtains. Parked haphazardly in front of it was a battered pickup truck, its engine still ticking as it cooled. I crouched behind a fallen log, my hand on my weapon as I assessed the situation. That's when I heard it, A muffled cry, quickly silenced, coming from inside the cabin. My training kicked in, overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze me. I keyed my radio, keeping my voice low. Unit 17 to dispatch. I've got a 1033 at my location. Send all available units to Highway 61, mile marker 23. Follow the tire tracks into the woods. I didn't wait for a response. Someone was in trouble, and I was their only hope. Staying low, I crept towards the cabin, using the shadows for cover. As I got closer, I could make out voices, two men arguing in hushed but heated tones. "We can't keep her here," one voice hissed. "The cops will be all over this area by morning." "Shut up," the other growled. "We stick to the plan. Once we're paid, she's not our problem anymore." My blood ran cold. Kidnapping, human trafficking. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was ugly. I reached the side of the cabin, pressing myself against the rough wooden walls. Through a gap in the curtains, I could just make out two men, one tall and lean, the other shorter and stockier. Between them, bound to a chair, was a young woman. Her eyes were wide with terror, a gag muffling her cries. I had to act now. Taking a deep breath, I stepped back, raised my leg, and kicked the door with all my might. It splintered inward with a resounding crash. "Police! Don't move!" The next few seconds were a blur of shouting and movement. The taller man lunged for a weapon on the table. Without hesitation, I fired, the report of my gun deafening in the small space. He went down, clutching his shoulder. The stocky one made a break for the back door. I tackled him, driving him to the ground. We grappled, rolling across the dirty floor. He was strong, fueled by desperation, but I had training and righteousness on my side. Finally, I pinned him, snapping the cuffs around his wrists with grim satisfaction. "You're under arrest," I panted. "You have the right to remain silent." As I recited the Miranda rights, I became aware of the sound of approaching sirens. Backup was finally arriving. I secured the other suspect, then turned my attention to the young woman. Her eyes were brimming with tears as I gently removed her gag and began untying her bonds. "It's okay," I assured her. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" "Sarah," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Sarah Jennings. They took me from the gas station. My car." "We found it," I said softly. "That's how we knew to look for you. You're very brave, Sarah. It's over now." The cabin was soon swarming with officers. As I gave my statement and helped process the scene, I couldn't shake the feeling of how close we'd come to tragedy. If I hadn't followed those tracks, if I'd waited for backup. Hours later, as the first light of dawn began to break over the trees, I found myself back at my cruiser. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving me exhausted but wired. Sarah had been taken to the hospital, shaken but largely unharmed. Her kidnappers were in custody, facing a laundry list of charges. It was a win, a clear-cut case of good triumphing over evil. So why did I feel so uneasy? As I climbed into my cruiser, my eyes fell on the map I'd taken from the abandoned car. The circled location wasn't far from where we'd found the cabin, but why circle it? And what was the significance of that remote spot? Something told me this case was far from over. The kidnappers had mentioned a plan, a payment. Were they working for someone else? Was Sarah their only victim, or were there others? I stared at the map, the red circle seeming to pulse in the early morning light. Whatever answers lay hidden in those woods, I was determined to find them. As I started the engine and pulled onto the highway, I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The real investigation was just getting started, and I had a feeling it would lead us down a dark and dangerous path. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, I had a report to file and a pot of coffee with my name on it. Being a hero, it turns out, is exhausting work. As I drove back to the station, the rising sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder of why I did this job. To protect, to serve, to make sure that people like Sarah got to see another sunrise. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever darkness still lurked in those woods, I was ready to face it, because that's what we do. We run towards the danger, we shine a light in the dark places, and we never, ever give up. Just another night on the job for a highway patrol officer. But somehow, I had a feeling it was a night I'd never forget. Story 7. The first scream came at 2:37 a.m. I know because I was staring at the garish red numbers on the bedside clock, willing sleep to come. By the time the second scream tore through the thin walls of the Starlight Motel, I was already fumbling for the baseball bat I'd stashed under the bed. We never should have stopped here. But when you're on hour 14 of a cross-country drive with two cranky kids in the back seat and a storm brewing on the horizon, even a rundown roadside motel starts to look like the Ritz. It had been my wife Sarah's idea to push on through the night. "We'll make better time," she'd said, Ennis, "and the kids will sleep through most of it." That plan lasted until our youngest, Mia, started wailing about needing a bathroom, and our son Jake began threatening to puke if we didn't stop soon. So when we saw the flickering neon sign of the Starlight Motel cutting through the drizzle, it felt like salvation. The fact that we were the only car in the parking lot should have been our first clue that something was off. The check-in process was quick, handled by a sleepy-eyed clerk who barely looked up from his dog-eared paperback. He handed over a key attached to a faded plastic fob and grunted out directions to our room. As we trudged through the rain to our door, Sarah leaned in close. "It's just for one night," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "We'll be back on the road before you know it." If only she'd been right. The room itself was about what you'd expect from a place charging $30 a night. Two sagging queen beds covered in faded floral bedspreads. A TV that looked like it had been new when Reagan was president. Thin carpet that might have once been green but was now a sort of mottled gray. But it was the little details that set my nerves on edge. The long scratch marks on the inside of the bathroom door. The faint coppery smell underneath the overwhelming scent of bleach. The way the window was painted shut. "Daddy, I don't like it here," Mia said, clutching her stuffed rabbit close to her chest. I forced a smile. "It's okay, sweet pea. We're only staying till morning. Why don't you and Jake get ready for bed?" As the kids changed into pajamas, I pulled Sarah aside. "I've got a bad feeling about this place," I murmured. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know it's not great, but it's late and the storm's getting worse. We don't have much choice." A crack of thunder punctuated her words, making us all jump. Rain lashed against the window, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a face peering in at us. But when I blinked, there was nothing there but darkness and streaming water. We settled in for the night, the kids sharing one bed while Sarah and I took the other. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the ancient building, every gust of wind set my teeth on edge. And then came the scream. I was out of bed in an instant, bat in hand. Sarah sat up, eyes wide. "What was that?" "I don't know," I said, moving towards the door. "Stay with the kids. I'm going to check it out." "Are you crazy?" she hissed. "Don't go out there." I hesitated, hand on the doorknob. She was right, of course. The smart thing would be to stay put, maybe call the front desk. But something in that scream, the raw terror of it, wouldn't let me sit idle. "I'll be right back," I promised. Locked the door behind me. The hallway was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes, casting everything in a sickly green glow. The worn carpet muffled my footsteps as I crept towards the front of the motel, straining my ears for any sound. I was halfway down the hall when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from one of the rooms. As I got closer, I could make out muffled voices. One high and pleading, the other a low, menacing growl. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door. Room 113. The thumping grew louder, and now I could hear what sounded like scratching, like someone was clawing desperately at the other side of the door. I raised my hand to knock, bat held ready in the other, but before I could make contact, the noises suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. Then slowly the door began to open. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the bat. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered. He was shirtless, his chest and arms covered in an intricate maze of tattoos. But it was his eyes that held me rooted to the spot, cold and empty like a shark's. "Can I help you?" His voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I heard screaming. Is everything okay in there?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's fine. My wife had a nightmare, that's all. Sorry if we disturbed you." From behind him, I heard a muffled whimper. The man's smile never wavered, but his eyes flicked to something over my shoulder. I turned, half expecting to see Sarah or one of the kids. Instead, I found myself face to face with the night clerk. He stood at the end of the hallway, a shotgun cradled in his arms. "Is there a problem here?" the clerk asked, his tone making it clear that there had better not be. I looked back at the tattooed man, then to the clerk. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab my family and get as far away from this place as possible, but I was outnumbered and outgunned. "No," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "No problem. Just a misunderstanding. I'll head back to my room now." The man in the doorway nodded, still smiling that empty smile. "You do that. Have a good night." I walked back down the hallway, feeling their eyes boring into my back. It took every ounce of willpower not to break into a run. As I reached my door, I heard the clerk's voice, low and threatening. "Remember our arrangement. No loose ends." I fumbled with the key, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get it in the lock. As soon as I was inside, Sarah was on me. "What happened? What did you see?" I shook my head, trying to clear it. "We need to leave. Now." "What? Why? It's the middle of the night and the storm." "Sarah," I cut her off, gripping her shoulders. "Something is very wrong here. I don't have time to explain. We need to get the kids and go." She must have seen the fear in my eyes because she didn't argue further. We woke the kids, ignoring their sleepy protests as we quickly packed our things. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sound in the hallway. Hearing nothing, I opened it a crack and peered out. The corridor was empty, the tattooed man and the clerk nowhere in sight. "Okay," I whispered. "We're going to move fast and quiet, straight to the car. No matter what, don't stop." We made it halfway down the hall before all hell broke loose. A door burst open behind us and I heard the clerk's voice shouting, "They're running!" "Go!" I yelled, pushing Sarah and the kids ahead of me. We sprinted for the exit, the sound of heavy footsteps close behind. We burst out into the parking lot, rain soaking us instantly. The storm was in full force now, lightning illuminating the scene in stark flashes. "Get in the car!" I shouted, fumbling for the keys. I heard the distinctive sound of a shotgun being racked and dove to the side just as a blast tore through the space where I'd been standing. Sarah had the kids in the back seat. I scrambled to the driver's side, my hand slipping on the wet door handle. Another shot rang out, pellets pinging off the car's metal frame. I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as a large shape loomed in the headlights. The tattooed man, a wicked-looking knife in his hand. I slammed the car into reverse, tires squealing on the wet asphalt. We fishtailed wildly, narrowly missing the clerk as he took aim with the shotgun again. I shifted into drive and floored it, heading for the highway. In the rearview mirror, I could see figures running after us, growing smaller as we pulled away. Soon, the motel's neon sign faded into the rainy darkness behind us. We drove in silence for several miles, the only sounds the pounding rain and our ragged breathing. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice shaky. What just happened back there?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. Let's just focus on putting as many miles between us and that place as we can." As we sped through the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something truly horrific. I also couldn't escape the gnawing guilt that we might have left others behind to face whatever evil lurked in that motel. But right now, all that mattered was that my family was safe. We'd find another place to stay, somewhere with bright lights and lots of people. And in the morning, we'd make some calls to the police, the FBI, whoever would listen. Because one thing was certain, the Starlight Motel was harboring dark secrets, and someone needed to shine a light on them before more innocent travelers fell into its trap. Story 8. The tapping on my window wasn't unusual. Lot lizards were a dime a dozen at truck stops. But when I saw her face, wide-eyed, terrified, silently mouthing, "Help me," I knew this night was about to take a turn I'd never forget. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, my eyes burning from the endless stretch of highway. The GPS said I was somewhere in the middle of Nebraska. Though out here, with nothing but darkness and cornfields in every direction, it might as well have been the moon. The truck stop appeared like an oasis in the desert, its fluorescent lights cutting through the inky blackness. I pulled my rig into a spot at the far end of the lot, away from the handful of other trucks. Force of habit, I guess. In this line of work, you learn to appreciate your solitude when you can get it. I killed the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of road noise. My body ached as I stretched, bones popping in protest. Coffee. I needed coffee if I was going to make it through the night. I was just about to open the door when I heard it, a soft tapping, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. I froze, listening. There it was again, more insistent this time. Lot lizards weren't uncommon at places like this. Women, and sometimes men, selling companionship to lonely truckers. I'd always politely declined, but some of my colleagues weren't so discriminating. Sighing, I turned to the passenger window, ready to wave them off. But the words died in my throat as I saw her face. She was young, maybe early 20s, with wide blue eyes that seemed to take up half her face. Her blonde hair was disheveled, and even in the dim light, I could see the fear etched into every line of her face. She wasn't saying anything, but her lips were moving frantically, forming the same two words over and over. Help me. My heart began to race. This was no lot lizard. This was something else entirely. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, movement behind the woman caught my eye. A man appeared, his face hidden in shadow. He grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her away from my truck. In that moment, I had a choice to make. I could pretend I hadn't seen anything, start up my rig and drive away. It would be the safe thing to do, the smart thing. But as I watched the woman being dragged away, her eyes locked on mine, silently pleading, I knew I couldn't just sit there. I threw open the door, nearly falling in my haste to get out. The cool night air hit me like a slap, chasing away the last vestiges of fatigue. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the parking lot. "Let her go!" The man turned, and for the first time I got a good look at his face. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with a scraggly beard and cold, dead eyes. He sneered at me, revealing yellowed teeth. "Mind your own business, trucker," he growled, tightening his grip on the woman's arm. She winced in pain but didn't make a sound. I took a step forward, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. I'm not a small guy. Years of loading and unloading cargo have given me a solid build. But this man had an air of danger about him that made my skin crawl. "I'm making it my business," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "Let her go, and we can all walk away from this." The man's eyes narrowed, assessing me. For a moment, I thought he might back down, but then he shoved the woman aside and reached behind his back. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the glint of metal as he pulled out a gun, saw his finger tightening on the trigger. I dove to the side, feeling the wind of the bullet as it whizzed past my ear. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the quiet night. I hit the ground hard, the asphalt scraping my palms. Adrenaline surged through me as I scrambled for cover behind a nearby car. My mind was racing. This was insane. Things like this didn't happen in real life, not to ordinary truckers like me. I should have stayed in my cab, should have minded my own business. But as I peered around the car, I saw the woman. She had fallen when the man pushed her, and now she was crawling towards me, her eyes wide with terror. I couldn't leave her. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to make a run for it. But before I could move, I heard the screech of tires. A car came tearing around the corner of the truck stop, its headlights illuminating the scene. The man cursed, firing off another shot in my direction before turning and running. He disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the lot's lights. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard the woman's sobs, muffled but heart-wrenching. I crawled out from behind the car, my whole body shaking with residual adrenaline. "Are you okay?" I asked, reaching out to her. She flinched away at first, then seemed to recognize me. Without warning, she threw herself into my arms, her whole body shuddering with sobs. "It's okay," I murmured, awkwardly patting her back. "You're safe now." The car that had interrupted the confrontation pulled up beside us. The door opened and a man in a police uniform stepped out. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, his hand on his holstered weapon. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what had just happened? The woman in my arms stirred, lifting her tear-stained face. He kidnapped me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 days ago, in Omaha. This man, he saved me." The officer's eyebrows shot up, but to his credit, he didn't waste time with questions. He grabbed his radio, calling for backup and an ambulance. The next few hours passed in a blur. More police arrived, cordoning off the area. I gave my statement at least 3 times, describing the man, the gun, everything I could remember. The woman, her name was Sarah, I learned, was taken to the hospital. Before she left in the ambulance, she gripped my hand tightly. "Thank you," she said, her eyes shining with tears. "You saved my life." I didn't know how to respond to that. I hadn't felt like a hero. I'd been terrified, acting on instinct more than anything else. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the truck stop, a detective approached me. He looked tired, but there was a glint of excitement in his eyes. "We got him," he said without preamble. "Caught him trying to steal a car about 5 miles down the road. And get this, he's wanted in connection with 3 other abductions in the Midwest." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was over. Sarah was safe and her kidnapper was in custody. The detective clapped me on the shoulder. "You did good, son. Not many people would have gotten involved like that. You're a hero." I shook my head. "I'm not a hero," I said. "I'm just a trucker who couldn't look the other way." He smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. Sometimes that's all it takes to be a hero. As I climbed back into my rig a few hours later, my mind was still reeling from the night's events. The open road stretched out before me, familiar and yet somehow different now. I thought about Sarah, hoped she was getting the care and support she needed. I thought about the man who had taken her, wondered what darkness drove someone to do such terrible things. But mostly, I thought about choices. The choice I'd made to get involved, the choice to risk my life for a stranger. It hadn't been a conscious decision, really. In that moment, faced with someone in desperate need, there had been no choice at all. As I merged onto the highway, the rising sun at my back, I realized something. The world was full of darkness, yes, but it was also full of people who, when faced with that darkness, chose to stand against it. I was just a trucker, not a hero, but maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The open road beckoned, and with it the promise of new days and new choices. I settled in for the long haul, grateful for the quiet and the solitude, but also newly aware of the connections that bound us all together in this vast, complicated world. Whatever came next, I knew I'd face it the same way I'd faced the night before, 1 mile at a time, with my eyes open and my heart ready. Story 9. The stench hit me first, that sickly sweet odor of decay that clings to your nostrils and turns your stomach. But in this job, you get used to it. What I wasn't prepared for was the laptop we found buried beneath bags of rotting produce and greasy fast food wrappers. "Hey Mike, check this out," I called to my partner, hefting the grimy device from the pile. It was just another Tuesday morning on our usual garbage collection route. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across the sleepy suburban streets. We'd been at it for hours already, the monotonous rhythm of lift, dump, and move on lulling us into a trance-like state. But this was different. Mike ambled over, his weathered face creasing with curiosity. "Well, ain't that something? Wonder if it still works." I wiped some of the grime off the laptop's surface with my gloved hand. It was an older model, but seemed to be in decent shape despite its ignominious resting place. "Only one way to find out," I shrugged, flipping open the lid. To our surprise, the screen flickered to life. The battery must have been nearly full when it was tossed out. "We shouldn't," Mike said, but he made no move to stop me as I navigated to the desktop. What we saw next made my blood run cold. The wallpaper was a collage of faces, dozens of them. Men, women, children, all with the same vacant, terrified expressions. But it was the folders neatly arranged on the desktop that really caught my attention. Targets, locations, schedules. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, his face pale in the early morning light. With trembling fingers, I clicked on the Targets folder. It opened to reveal more photos, each labeled with a name and date. Some of the dates were in the past, others yet to come. "We need to call the cops," I said, my mouth dry. Mike nodded, already reaching for his phone, but before he could dial, a notification popped up on the screen. New message from the collector. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. The message was short and chilling. "Job complete. Payment received. Next target, Emily Larson, 742 Evergreen Terrace. Surveillance begins tonight." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This wasn't just some sick fantasy. This was real, and it was happening right here in our town. "Mike," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to—" The sound of screeching tires cut me off. A black van had rounded the corner at high speed, heading straight for us. "Run!" I yelled, slamming the laptop shut and clutching it to my chest. We sprinted down the street, the van in hot pursuit. I could hear angry shouts behind us, the sound of doors slamming. "Split up!" Mike gasped as we approached an intersection. "I'll lead them away. You get that laptop to the police." Before I could protest, he veered off down a side street, waving his arms and yelling to attract attention. The van hesitated for a moment, then peeled off after him. I didn't waste the opportunity. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning and legs screaming in protest. But I didn't dare slow down. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst through the doors of the police station, gasping for air and clutching the laptop like a lifeline. "Help!" I managed to choke out to the startled desk sergeant. "Evidence, missing persons." The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, statements, and barely contained panic. I told them everything, about finding the laptop, the photos, the message. I watched as hardened detectives paled at the contents of the files. But all I could think about was Mike. Where was he? Was he safe? It was late afternoon by the time they let me go, with strict instructions not to leave town and to call immediately if I remembered anything else. As I stepped out of the station, squinting in the harsh sunlight, a familiar voice called my name. "Dave, over here!" I turned to see Mike jogging towards me, looking disheveled but very much alive. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it made my knees weak. "Mike! Thank God!" I said, grabbing him in a bear hug. "What happened? How did you get away?" He grinned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lost him in that new housing development. All those twisty streets, they didn't stand a chance. Doubled back here as soon as I could. I filled him in on what had happened at the station, watching his expression grow more serious with each detail." "They're saying it's big, Mike," I concluded. "Like multi-state trafficking ring big. The feds are on their way." He nodded solemnly. "Good, that's good." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the day's events settling over us like a heavy blanket. "You know," Mike said finally, "I always wondered if we'd ever find anything really important on the job. Guess today was the day, huh? I managed a weak chuckle. "Yeah, I guess so. Though I think I preferred it when the most exciting thing we found was Mrs. Henderson's expired coupon stash." Mike laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Listen, David, about what happened today. Maybe we should keep it between us, you know? No need to tell the other guys on the crew." I frowned, a flicker of unease stirring in my gut. "What do you mean?" "Mike, we're witnesses in a major criminal investigation. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." He shifted uncomfortably, not meeting my eyes. I know. It's just, well, you know how people talk. Might make things awkward at work is all." Something about his demeanor was off. The Mike I knew would be itching to tell this story to anyone who'd listen. This hesitancy, this nervousness, it wasn't like him at all. And then it hit me. The van, the chase, the convenient escape. "Mike," I said slowly, taking a step back, "how did you know I brought the laptop to the police?" His head snapped up, eyes widening for a fraction of a second before his expression smoothed into careful neutrality. "What? You just told me, didn't you?" But I hadn't. I'd been so relieved to see him. I hadn't gotten to that part of the story yet. My mind was racing, piecing together fragments of memory, the way Mike had been acting strange lately, taking long phone calls in hushed tones, the unexplained cash I'd glimpsed in his wallet, the fact that he'd been the one to suggest we take this particular route today, deviating from our usual schedule. "Oh, God," I breathed, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "It was you. All along, it was you." Mike's face hardened, all pretense of friendliness evaporating. "Dave, buddy, you're not thinking straight. It's been a long day. Why don't we go get a beer, talk this through?" He reached for my arm, but I jerked away. "Don't touch me. How could you, Mike? Those people. Those children." A cold smile spread across his face, transforming my old friend into a stranger. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Dave. No idea at all. But I'm giving you one chance, just one, to walk away. Forget what you saw. Forget this conversation. Go home to your wife and kids and pretend none of this ever happened." I was backing away now, my heart pounding. "You know I can't do that, Mike." He sighed, reaching into his jacket. "I was afraid you'd say that. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it had to end this way. You were a good partner." I saw the glint of metal as he withdrew a gun, and in that moment I knew my life would never be the same. In the space of a single day, I'd gone from a simple garbage collector to a man running for his life with knowledge that made me a target for forces I could barely comprehend. As I turned and ran, Mike's words echoed in my ears. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." He was right. I didn't. But I had a feeling I was about to find out, whether I wanted to or not. The chase that had begun this morning with a discarded laptop was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And as the sound of Mike's footsteps pounded behind me, I realized that the stench of decay I'd smelled earlier wasn't just coming from the garbage. It was coming from the rot at the heart of our town, a corruption that ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. And now, for better or worse, I was part of it. Just another Tuesday on the garbage route, not anymore. Not ever again. Story 10. The moment she slid into my back seat, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary ride. Her eyes were wild, darting from side to side like a cornered animal. She clutched a small duffel bag to her chest as if her life depended on it. But it was her first words that sent a chill down my spine. "Drive. Please, just drive. They're coming." I'm not proud to admit it, but my first instinct was to tell her to get out. In my 3 years as an Uber driver, I'd had my share of weird passengers, but something about this woman set off every alarm bell in my head. But before I could say anything, she let out a strangled sob that tugged at whatever was left of my conscience. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'll pay you double, triple, anything. Just get me out of here." I hesitated for a moment longer, then put the car in drive. As we pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rear-view mirror. A dark figure emerging from the shadows of the apartment building we'd just left. My passenger saw it too and sank lower in her seat. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't care," she said. "You just keep driving. Take the highway out of town." I merged onto the nearly empty highway, the clock on my dashboard reading 2:17 a.m. The city lights faded behind us as we headed into the darkness of the countryside. For a while, we drove in silence. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, both to keep an eye on my passenger and to check if we were being followed. So far, the road behind us remained empty. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. "Look, I don't mean to pry, but are you in some kind of trouble?" She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You could say that. Have you ever made a mistake so big, so monumentally stupid, that you knew your life would never be the same?" I thought about the string of bad decisions that had led to me driving strangers around in the middle of the night to make ends meet. "I might have some idea." She leaned forward, her face appearing in my rearview mirror. In the dim light from the dashboard, I could see she was younger than I'd first thought, maybe mid-20s, pretty, in a haunted sort of way. "I saw something I shouldn't have," she said. "Heard something I was never meant to hear, and now they want to make sure I never tell anyone." A chill ran down my spine. "They? Who's they?" She shook her head. "It's better if you don't know. Safer for you that way." We lapsed back into silence. The monotonous hum of tires on asphalt and the soft glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness were almost hypnotic. I was just starting to relax when my passenger suddenly bolted upright. "There!" she hissed, pointing at my side mirror. "The black SUV, it's them!" I squinted at the mirror. Sure enough, a large, dark vehicle was gaining on us fast. "Are you sure?" I asked, my heart rate picking up. "It could just be another driver." "I'm sure," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Please, you have to lose them." I pressed down on the accelerator, the engine of my old Civic protesting as we picked up speed. The SUV matched our pace, drawing closer. "Hold on," I said, spotting an exit ahead. I cut across 2 lanes of empty highway and took the off-ramp at the last second, tires squealing. We found ourselves on a narrow country road lined with dense trees on both sides. I killed the headlights and navigated by moonlight, praying we wouldn't meet any oncoming traffic. After a few tense minutes of winding through the darkness, I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, cutting the engine. "I think we lost them," I said, letting out a shaky breath. My passenger was quiet for a moment, then, "Turn right up ahead. There's a dirt road that leads to an old barn. We can hide there for a bit." I wanted to ask how she knew about this place, but decided it was better not to. I started the car and followed her directions. The barn loomed out of the darkness, a hulking silhouette against the star-filled sky. I pulled around to the far side, out of sight of the main road. As soon as I cut the engine, my passenger was out of the car, duffel bag in hand. "Come on," she said. "We shouldn't stay in the open." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stay in the car, to call the police, to get as far away from this situation as possible. But curiosity, and if I'm being honest, a small thrill of excitement got the better of me. Inside, the barn was musty and filled with shadows. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, providing just enough light to avoid tripping over the debris scattered across the floor. My passenger moved with surprising confidence, leading me to a back corner where a rickety ladder led up to a hayloft. "Up here," she whispered. "We'll be able to see if anyone comes." I followed her up, trying not to think about how easily this ladder could collapse under our weight. The hayloft was mostly empty, save for a few moldy bales and what looked like an old horse blanket. We settled in, backs against the wall, facing the barn's entrance. For a long moment, the only sound was our breathing and the occasional creak of the old structure settling. "So," I said finally, keeping my voice low, "want to tell me what's really going on?" She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me," I said. "I've heard some pretty wild stories in this job." She was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, in a rush, the words started pouring out. "I worked for a tech company. Nothing big, just a startup trying to break into the AI market. But we had some promising algorithms, caught the attention of some bigger players. One night I was working late, and I overheard our CEO talking to someone. They were discussing using our AI for things, terrible things, manipulating elections, controlling the flow of information, even predicting and influencing people's behavior on a mass scale." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I knew I had to do something, tell someone, but before I could, they caught me. I managed to grab a hard drive with evidence before I ran, but they've been after me ever since." I sat there, trying to process what she'd just told me. It sounded like something out of a conspiracy theory podcast, and yet, the fear in her voice, the way she'd been acting all night, it felt real. "That's a lot to take in," I said finally. She let out a bitter laugh. "I told you wouldn't believe me." "I didn't say that," I replied. "It's just, if what you're saying is true, these people sound incredibly dangerous. What's your plan?" She clutched her duffel bag tighter. "I have a contact, someone who can help me get this information to the right people. I just need to stay alive long enough to reach them." Before I could respond, a sound cut through the night tires on gravel. We both froze. "They found us," she whispered, panic edging into her voice. I crept to the edge of the hayloft and peered down. Through a gap in the barn doors, I could see headlights approaching. "We need to move," I said, turning back to her. "Is there another way out of here?" She nodded, pointing to the far end of the loft. "There's a window. It's a bit of a drop, but there's a slope that should make it manageable." We made our way to the window as quietly as possible. I could hear car doors slamming outside, followed by voices. "Ladies first," I whispered, helping her onto the windowsill. She paused, looking back at me. "You should stay here. You're not involved in this. If they find you, just tell them you were on a normal ride and I made you drive out here." I shook my head. "No way, I'm in this now. Besides, you still owe me for the fare." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Then she was gone, slipping out into the night. I followed, heart pounding. We half ran, half slid down the slope behind the barn, ducking into the tree line just as flashlight beams cut through the darkness behind us. "This way," she whispered, taking my hand and pulling me deeper into the woods. As we crashed through the underbrush, questions raced through my mind. Was I really doing this? Throwing myself into some kind of high-stakes corporate espionage plot? What about my job, my life back in the city? But as I glanced at the woman beside me, her face set with determination despite the fear in her eyes, I knew I couldn't turn back now. For better or worse, my ordinary life as an Uber driver had taken a dramatic turn. "I'm Alex, by the way," I said as we paused to catch our breath. She hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Zoe, my name is Zoe." In the distance, we could hear voices calling out, searching. Zoe squeezed my hand. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, surprised to find that I meant it. "Ready." And together we plunged deeper into the unknown, leaving the lights of pursuit behind us. Story 11. The moment the elevator doors closed, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The man's trembling hands and the dark stain on his shirt screamed danger, but it was the wild look in his eyes that made my blood run cold. As the elevator lurched to a stop between floors, I realized this delivery might be my last. I'd been working as a bicycle courier in the city for just over a year. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept me in shape. Plus, I enjoyed the freedom of zipping through traffic, the wind in my face as I navigated the urban jungle. This particular day had been uneventful, a few document deliveries, a couple of small packages, nothing out of the ordinary. As evening approached, I got a ping for one last job, a package delivery to the 18th floor of a high-rise apartment building downtown. Easy enough, I thought. I arrived at the building just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the bustling street. The doorman barely glanced at me as I wheeled my bike inside and made my way to the bank of elevators. The package wasn't heavy, just a small box about the size of a shoebox. I didn't think much of it as I pressed the call button for the elevator. As I waited, a man hurried through the lobby, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He was average height, maybe in his 40s, with thinning hair and a paunch that spoke of too many nights of takeout and beer. But it was his demeanor that caught my attention. He was agitated, his eyes darting around the lobby as if expecting someone to jump out at him at any moment. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and he was muttering to himself, words I couldn't quite make out. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. I hesitated for a moment, some instinct telling me to wait for the next one. But that would be silly, right? I was just being paranoid. I stepped inside, moving to the back corner. The man followed, jabbing at the button for the top floor with more force than necessary. As the doors closed, I caught a whiff of something metallic and vaguely unpleasant. That's when I noticed the stain on his shirt. It was dark, about the size of my fist, right in the center of his chest. In the harsh fluorescent light of the elevator, it looked disturbingly like blood. My heart began to race. I clutched the package tighter as if it could somehow protect me. The elevator began its ascent, each floor passing with agonizing slowness. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe he'd just spilled something on himself. Maybe he was having a bad day. There could be 100 innocent explanations for his behavior and appearance. But then I saw his hands. He'd taken them out of his pockets, and they were shaking uncontrollably. Not just a slight tremor, but violent spasms that he seemed unable to control. And there, on his right hand, I saw more of that dark, reddish stain. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I wanted to say something, to break the oppressive silence in the elevator, but fear had robbed me of my voice. We passed the 10th floor, then the 11th. I willed the elevator to move faster, silently pleading with whatever higher power might be listening to just get me to my floor so I could complete this delivery and get the hell out of there. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as we reached the 13th floor, because of course it would be the 13th floor, the elevator shuddered. There was a grinding noise from somewhere above us, and then with a sickening lurch, we came to a stop. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the rapid beating of my heart and the man's ragged breathing. Then he turned to me, his eyes wide and wild. "No," he muttered. "No, no, no, this can't be happening. Not now." I pressed myself further into the corner, wishing I could somehow melt into the wall. "I'm sure it's just a temporary glitch," I said, my voice sounding weak and unconvincing even to my own ears. "They'll have us moving again in no time." He wasn't listening. He began to pace the small confines of the elevator, running his trembling hands through his hair. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising in pitch. "I need to get out of here. I need to get to the roof." I nodded, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. Okay, that's fine. We just need to wait for maintenance to get the elevator moving again. It shouldn't take long. He whirled on me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood turn to ice. It was a look of desperation, of a man pushed to the very edge of sanity. "You don't get it," he shouted. "They're coming for me. They know what I did, and they're coming. I need to get to the roof. It's the only way out." My mind was racing. What had he done? Who was coming for him? And why did he need to get to the roof? A horrible thought occurred to me. Was he planning to jump? I needed to keep him calm. If he lost it completely, trapped in this small space with me, things could go very bad very quickly. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Why don't you tell me what's going on? Maybe I can help." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Help? You can't help. Nobody can help now." He turned away, resuming his frantic pacing. I reached for my phone, intending to call for help, but he saw the movement. In an instant, he was on me, knocking the phone from my hand. It clattered to the floor, the screen cracking on impact. "No calls!" he snarled, his face inches from mine. I could smell alcohol on his breath, mixed with something else. Fear, perhaps. "They'll trace it. They'll find us." I held up my hands in a placating gesture. Okay, no calls. I'm sorry." He backed away, but his eyes remained fixed on me, watching my every move. I tried to control my breathing, to project an aura of calm I definitely didn't feel. "Can you at least tell me who's after you?" I asked, hoping that if I could get him talking, it might diffuse some of the tension. He was silent for a long moment, and I thought he might not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "My partners. We did something. Something bad. But they wanted more. They wanted to go further. I couldn't do it." A chill ran down my spine. What had this man been involved in, and what had been so bad that even he, clearly no saint, had balked at it? "So you tried to leave?" I prompted gently. He nodded, his eyes taking on a faraway look. "I told them I was out, that I wouldn't be a part of it anymore. They didn't take it well." I glanced at the stain on his shirt, a horrible realization dawning. "Did they hurt you?" He looked down as if seeing the stain for the first time. "Not me," he said softly. "My wife. She tried to stop them when they came to our apartment. She always was braver than me." My heart sank. The stain, the trembling hands, the desperate need to escape. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. "I'm so sorry," I said, and I meant it. Whatever this man had done, whatever he'd been involved in, nobody deserved to go through that. He slumped against the wall of the elevator, all the fight seeming to drain out of him. "I just need to get to the roof," he said, his voice hollow. "It's the only way out now." I knew I should try to talk him out of it, to tell him that suicide wasn't the answer, but who was I to judge? I had no idea what he'd been through, what horrors he'd seen or committed. Before I could say anything, there was a grinding noise from above. The elevator shuddered, then slowly began to move again. The man's head snapped up, panic flooding his features. "No," he whispered. "No, they found me. They're here." I wanted to tell him it was just the maintenance crew, that everything would be okay, but I couldn't bring myself to lie to him. As the elevator continued its ascent, I made a decision. I didn't know if it was the right one, but it felt like the only one I could make. "Listen," I said, my voice low and urgent. "When these doors open, run. I'll create a distraction, buy you some time. Just promise me you'll think twice before you do anything permanent, okay?" He stared at me, confusion and gratitude warring in his eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." I shrugged. "Because everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even if it's just a chance to try." The elevator dinged, signaling our arrival at the top floor. As the doors began to slide open, I saw a group of men in dark suits waiting in the hallway. "Now!" I shouted, launching myself out of the elevator. I collided with the nearest suit, sending us both sprawling. In the chaos that followed, I caught a glimpse of the man from the elevator sprinting towards the stairwell. As rough hands grabbed me, pulling me to my feet, I found myself hoping he'd make it, not just to the roof, but to whatever came after. To that chance at redemption. As for me, well, I had a feeling my days as a simple bicycle courier were over, but that was okay. Some deliveries, it turns out, are worth more than just a paycheck. Story 12. The first time I saw the tiny black lens nestled in the smoke detector above the bed, I thought I was imagining things. But as I stood on the rickety cleaning cart, peering closer, my heart sank. This was no hallucination. Room 237 of the Pinewood Motel had a hidden camera, and I had a sickening feeling it wasn't the only one. My name's Marta, and I've been cleaning rooms at this rundown roadside motel for the past 3 years. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and keeps a roof over my head. Or at least it did until that fateful Tuesday morning when everything changed. I'd started my shift like any other day, armed with my cleaning supplies and a stack of fresh towels. The Pinewood isn't exactly a 5-star establishment, more like a 2-star on a good day, but we get a steady stream of truckers, salespeople, and the occasional family looking for a cheap place to crash for the night. Room 237 was my third stop of the morning. As I pushed my cart through the door, I was hit by the usual musty smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. The room was a mess, bed unmade and empty beer cans littering every surface. Typical. I set about my work, stripping the bed and gathering the trash. That's when I noticed something odd about the smoke detector. It seemed off somehow, newer than the rest of the dated decor. Curiosity got the better of me. I dragged over my cleaning cart, climbed up, and that's when I saw it. The camera lens, so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it. My first instinct was to run, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But then I thought about all the people who'd stayed in this room. Families with children, couples seeking privacy, all of them unknowingly recorded in their most intimate moments. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures of the hidden camera. Evidence, I told myself. Then I finished cleaning the room as quickly as I could, trying to act normal even as my mind raced with questions and fears. As soon as my shift ended, I went straight to Mr. Patel, the motel manager. He was in his usual spot behind the front desk, poring over some paperwork. "Mr. Patel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you about something important." He looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Marta? I'm very busy." I glanced around to make sure we were alone, then pulled out my phone. "I found this in room 237, I said, showing him the pictures. "It's a hidden camera in the smoke detector." Mr. Patel's reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of shock or concern, his face hardened into a mask of anger. "You shouldn't be poking around where you don't belong," he snapped. "Forget what you saw. It's none of your business." I felt like I'd been slapped. But it's illegal. We can't spy on guests like that." He leaned in close, his voice low and threatening. "Listen carefully, Marta. You're a good worker, and I'd hate to have to fire you. Times are tough, and jobs aren't easy to come by, especially for someone like you, so I'm going to pretend this conversation never happened, and you're going to do the same. Understand?" I nodded mutely, too shocked and scared to argue. As I left the office, my mind was reeling. Mr. Patel knew about the cameras. He was involved. But how deep did this go? Over the next few days, I tried to act normal. I went about my cleaning duties, smiled at the guests, and pretended everything was fine. But inside, I was a mess of anxiety and indecision. I started paying more attention to the other rooms, looking for signs of hidden cameras. And once I knew what to look for, I found them everywhere. In light fixtures, behind mirrors, even in the air vents. The entire motel was wired for surveillance. But why? What could anyone possibly gain from spying on the down-on-their-luck travelers who stayed at the Pinewood? The answer came to me in fragments, overheard conversations, and odd observations that slowly pieced themselves together into a horrifying picture. It started with a guest in room 215, a nervous-looking man who seemed to be expecting someone. As I was changing the towels in his bathroom, I overheard him on the phone. "Yeah, I got the footage," he was saying. "Quality's not great, but it'll do. You were right about the girl in 237. She's perfect. My blood ran cold. They weren't just recording guests. They were targeting specific people." A few days later, I overheard two of the maintenance guys talking in the hallway. "New shipment coming in tonight," one said. "Boss says it's big money this time." "About time," the other replied. "I'm sick of nickel and dime blackmail jobs." Blackmail, that's what this was about. They were using the hidden cameras to gather compromising footage of guests, then extorting them for money. But the maintenance guy's comments suggested they were moving on to something even bigger. I knew I should go to the police, but I was scared. Mr. Patel's threat about my job wasn't idle. As an undocumented immigrant, my options were limited. And who knew how far this conspiracy reached? For all I knew, the local cops were in on it too. So I kept my head down and my eyes open, gathering what information I could. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything I saw and heard. If I couldn't go to the authorities, maybe I could find another way to expose what was happening. It all came to a head about a week after I'd discovered the first camera. I was cleaning room 118 when I heard raised voices from the parking lot. Peeking through the curtains, I saw Mr. Patel arguing with a woman I recognized as a guest from a few days ago. "You can't do this," she was shouting. "It's illegal." Mr. Patel's voice was calmer but no less menacing. "My dear, I think you'll find that we very much can. Unless, of course, you'd prefer we send that charming video to your husband." The woman's face crumpled. She reached into her purse with shaking hands and handed over an envelope. Mr. Patel's smile was triumphant as he thumbed through the contents. I felt sick. This wasn't just about money anymore. They were destroying lives. And I was complicit through my silence. That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I made my decision. I couldn't stand by and let this continue, but I needed help. The next morning, I approached Jenny, one of the other cleaning staff. We weren't close, but she'd always been kind to me. "Jenny," I said, my voice low, "I need to talk to you about something important, something dangerous." Her eyes widened, but she nodded. "Okay, Marta, what's going on?" Over the next hour, I told her everything. The cameras, the blackmail, my suspicions about worse things happening behind the scenes. To my relief, she believed me. "I've noticed things too," she admitted. Guests leaving in the middle of the night looking terrified. Strange men coming and going at odd hours. I knew something was off, but I had no idea it was this bad. Together, we hatched a plan. Jenny had a cousin who worked for a local news station. If we could gather enough evidence, maybe we could expose the whole operation without putting ourselves at risk. Over the next week, we worked in secret. Jenny distracted Mr. Patel and the maintenance staff while I snuck into rooms to document the hidden cameras. We eavesdropped on conversations, took photographs, and compiled all the information in my journal. It was terrifying work. Every day I expected to be discovered. Every night I had nightmares about what would happen if we were caught. But we persevered. And finally, after what felt like an eternity of fear and suspense, we had enough. Jenny's cousin came through. The story broke on a Tuesday evening, just as I was finishing my shift. By Wednesday morning, the Pinewood Motel was swarming with police and FBI agents. Mr. Patel and his accomplices were led away in handcuffs. As it turned out, the hidden camera operation was just the tip of the iceberg. They'd been involved in human trafficking, using the motel as a waypoint for smuggling people across state lines. In the days that followed, I gave statement after statement to the authorities. My undocumented status complicated things, but Jenny's cousin had put me in touch with a lawyer who was helping me apply for a special visa for crime victims who assist law enforcement. As I watched the last police car pull away from the motel, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, fear, pride, uncertainty. My life would never be the same, but I knew, deep in my heart, that I'd done the right thing. The Pinewood Motel was closed now, its dark secrets finally exposed to the light. And me? I was facing an uncertain future. But for the first time in years, I felt clean. Not just my hands, but my conscience. Who would have thought that a simple housekeeper would be the one to bring down a criminal empire? But then again, we see things others don't. We work in the background, invisible until we choose to be seen. As I turned away from the empty motel, I smiled to myself. My days of cleaning up other people's messes were over. It was time to start fresh, to build a new life free from the shadows of the past. And it all started with a tiny black lens hidden in a smoke detector. Sometimes the smallest things can change everything. Story 13. The suitcase moved. Just a little, but enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I'd been a hotel cleaner for 15 years, and I'd seen some strange things, but never had I encountered luggage with a mind of its own. It started as a normal Tuesday morning. I'd clocked in at the Pinewood Hotel at 7 a.m., same as always. The Pinewood wasn't much to look at, a mid-range establishment just off the highway, catering mostly to business travelers and the occasional family on a budget vacation. But it paid the bills, and most days the work was straightforward enough. I was halfway through my shift when I got to room 237. The occupant had checked out early that morning, according to the front desk. Just another businessman catching an early flight, or so I thought. The room looked tidy at first glance. Bed made, towels hung neatly, personal items cleared away. But as I started my usual cleaning routine, I noticed little details that seemed off. There was a faint metallic smell in the air, barely noticeable but persistent. The trash can was empty, but the bag had been changed. And then there was the suitcase. It sat in the corner, a large, expensive-looking thing made of black leather. Guests forgot luggage all the time, so that alone wasn't strange. What caught my attention was the padlock securing it shut, a heavy-duty thing that seemed excessive for a simple business trip. I made a mental note to report the forgotten suitcase to Lost and Found. But as I turned to start cleaning the bathroom, I heard it. A soft, muffled thump. I froze, holding my breath. For a long moment, there was only silence. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination when I heard it again. This time, I was sure the sound was coming from the suitcase. My first thought was that it must be some kind of electronic device left on by mistake. A vibrating razor, maybe, or an alarm clock. But as I cautiously approached the suitcase, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A small, dark stain on the carpet beneath it. With trembling hands, I knelt down to examine the stain. It was barely noticeable against the dark carpet, but up close I could see its rusty color. And it was damp. That's when the suitcase moved. It wasn't much, just a slight shift, as if something inside had suddenly changed position. But it was enough to send me scrambling backwards, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I sat there on the floor, trying to process what I'd just seen. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe it was an animal, a cat or small dog the guest had smuggled in. That would explain the movement, the sound, but not the stain, not the smell. I knew I should call security. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But curiosity, or maybe some deeper, more primal instinct, held me back. Instead, I found myself reaching for my phone, dialing the number left by the guest for lost item returns. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. Hello? The voice was male, curt, and slightly breathless. Hi, this is Maria from housekeeping at the Pinewood Hotel, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm calling about an item left in your room, a suitcase. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, then, don't touch it. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Sir, I think there might be something, but he had already hung up. I stared at my phone, a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. His reaction had been strange, almost panicked. And why was he still so close if he'd checked out hours ago? The suitcase shifted again, more forcefully this time, and now, straining my ears, I could hear something else. A muffled sound that might have been a voice. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was it a kidnapping victim? Evidence of some horrible crime? Or something even worse? I stood up on shaky legs, edging towards the door. I needed to call security, to call the police. This was way beyond anything I was equipped to handle. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard it. Faint but unmistakable. A cry for help. In that moment, all thoughts of self-preservation vanished. Someone was in there, someone who needed help. And they only had minutes before whoever had left them there returned. I looked around the room frantically, searching for something to break the lock. My eyes landed on the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I grabbed the extinguisher and rushed back to the suitcase. Hold on, I called out, hoping whoever was inside could hear me. I'm going to get you out. I brought the extinguisher down on the padlock with all my strength. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th hit, the lock finally gave way with a satisfying crack. Heart pounding, I unzipped the suitcase and flung it open. The sight that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my days. Crammed inside, bound and gagged, was a young woman. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face pale and streaked with tears. She couldn't have been more than 20. Oh my God, I breathed, reaching out to remove the gag. It's okay, you're safe now. I'm going to call for help. As soon as the gag was free, she gasped out, He's coming back. We have to go, now. I helped her out of the suitcase, my hands shaking as I worked to untie her bonds. Who did this to you? What happened?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There's no time. Please, we have to leave before he returns." I nodded, helping her to her feet. She was unsteady, her limbs stiff from being confined. "Lean on me," I said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "We'll take the service elevator. It's closer." We had just made it into the hallway when the ding of the main elevator stopped us cold. The doors slid open, revealing a man in a sharp business suit. His eyes locked onto us, widening in shock before narrowing with rage. "Run!" I yelled, pulling the girl towards the service elevator at the end of the hall. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind us as we half ran, half stumbled down the corridor. The girl was moving as fast as she could, but her legs were still weak from being trapped in the suitcase. We reached the service elevator, and I jabbed the call button repeatedly, praying it would arrive quickly. The man was getting closer, his breath audible now. Just as his hand was about to close on the girl's arm, the elevator doors opened. We tumbled inside, and I slammed my fist against the lobby button. The doors began to close agonizingly slowly. The man reached the elevator just as the doors shut, his furious face disappearing from view. We both sank to the floor, gasping for breath. "Thank you," the girl whispered, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life." I squeezed her hand, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. "What's your name?" "Emily," she said. "I'm Emily." Before I could ask any more questions, the elevator doors opened onto the lobby. I helped Emily to her feet, scanning the area for any sign of her captor. "We need to get to the front desk," I said. "They can call the police, get you some help." But Emily shook her head violently. "No police, not yet. He's powerful, connected. We need to get somewhere safe first." I hesitated, torn between my instinct to get her immediate help and the fear in her eyes. Finally, I nodded. "Okay, I know a place, but we have to hurry." We made our way across the lobby as casually as we could, my arm around Emily to support her. Just as we reached the main doors, I heard a commotion behind us. The man had taken the main elevator down and was arguing with the front desk staff. We slipped out onto the street, the bright morning sun a stark contrast to the darkness we'd just escaped. My old Honda was parked in the employee lot around the side of the building. "Get in," I said, unlocking the doors. "We'll go to my sister's place. It's not far, and he won't think to look for you there." As we pulled out of the parking lot, I saw the man burst out of the hotel's front doors, his head swiveling as he searched for us. Our eyes met for a brief moment as I turned onto the main road. The look of cold fury on his face made me step harder on the gas. Emily huddled in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I can't thank you enough," she said softly. "You risked everything for a complete stranger." I glanced over at her, this young woman who had been through an ordeal I could scarcely imagine. "I did what anyone would do," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. As we merged onto the highway, putting distance between us and the Pinewood Hotel, I realized my life had changed irrevocably. My simple existence as a hotel cleaner was over. Now I was harboring a fugitive, running from a dangerous man with unknown resources. But looking at Emily, seeing the mix of fear and hope in her eyes, I knew I'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever dangers we might face, I couldn't regret the decision that had saved her life. "We'll figure this out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You're safe now. That's what matters." As the city faded behind us, I couldn't help but wonder what secrets Emily held, what storm we were driving into. But for now, all that mattered was the open road ahead and the promise of sanctuary at its end. Story 14. The moment I stepped into that house, I knew something was terribly wrong. The family photos on the wall told a story, but the person who greeted me wasn't part of it. As the front door clicked shut behind me, I realized this delivery might be my last. It was supposed to be a routine drop-off, just another order in my endless stream of food deliveries. The address was in one of those upscale neighborhoods where the houses looked more like small castles with manicured lawns and luxury cars in every driveway. I'd delivered to places like this before, usually to bored housewives or overworked executives too busy to cook for themselves. The order itself was massive, enough food to feed a small army. My motorcycle was weighed down with bags of Chinese takeout, the smell of kung pao chicken and beef with broccoli filling the air around me. As I pulled up to the house, I couldn't help but whistle. It was a sprawling two-story affair, all brick and gleaming windows, with a 3-car garage and a fountain bubbling away in the front yard. I dismounted, grabbing the bags of food, and made my way up the winding path to the front door. The porch light flickered on as I approached, triggered by a motion sensor. I rang the doorbell, hearing its chimes echo through the house. For a long moment there was silence. I was just about to ring again when I heard footsteps approaching. The door swung open, revealing a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a crisp, button-down shirt and slacks. "Ah, the food's here," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "Please come in. I'll need help carrying all of this to the kitchen." I hesitated. It wasn't standard procedure to enter a customer's home, but it wasn't unheard of either, especially with large orders like this. Plus, the guy seemed friendly enough. "Sure, no problem," I replied, stepping over the threshold. The entryway was impressive, with high ceilings and a chandelier that probably cost more than my yearly salary. But it was the wall of family photos that caught my eye. They showed a happy family: mom, dad, 2 kids, and a golden retriever. Typical American dream stuff. Except the man in the photos wasn't the one who had opened the door. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something was very, very wrong. I turned, intending to make a quick exit, but the sound of the door locking stopped me in my tracks. "Is everything okay?" the man asked, his tone still pleasant but with an edge I hadn't noticed before. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, everything's fine. Where would you like me to put these bags?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The kitchen is this way. Follow me." As we walked through the house, my mind raced. Who was this guy? Where was the real family? And most importantly, how the hell was I going to get out of here? The kitchen was as impressive as the rest of the house, all stainless steel appliances and marble countertops. I set the bags down, my hands shaking slightly. "That'll be $87.50, I said, hoping my voice didn't betray my fear. The man nodded, reaching for his wallet. "Of course, I've always wondered about you delivery drivers. You must see all sorts of interesting things going into strangers' homes like this." I forced a laugh. "Oh, it's mostly just hungry people. Nothing too exciting." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? I find that hard to believe. I bet you've got all sorts of stories. Why don't you stay and tell me a few? I've ordered plenty of food, after all." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Thanks for the offer, but I've got other deliveries to make. Maybe another time." I turned to leave, but he was suddenly there, blocking my path. The friendly facade was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "I'm afraid I must insist," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You see, I've gone to a lot of trouble to arrange this little meeting. It would be a shame to cut it short." My mind whirled. What did he mean he'd arranged this? Had he specifically requested me for this delivery, but why? "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Why don't you just let me go and we can forget this ever happened?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Forget? Oh, no. I don't think either of us will be forgetting this anytime soon. You see, you have something I need. Informations." I frowned, genuinely confused. "Information? About what?" "About the Millers," he said, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "The family that lives here, or rather lived here." The implications of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. The family in the photos. Had he done something to them? And why did he think I knew anything about it? "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "I just deliver food, man. I don't know anything about the people who live here." His expression hardened. "Don't lie to me. I know you've been here before, multiple times in fact. Always when the husband was away on business. Always late at night." Suddenly, it clicked. The Millers, I remembered them now. The pretty blonde wife who always ordered too much food, who sometimes invited me in for a drink while she wrote out a tip. The flirting, the lingering touches. I had been flattered, tempted even, but I'd never acted on it. I wasn't that kind of guy. But this man clearly thought otherwise. "You've got it all wrong," I said, desperately trying to explain. "Nothing ever happened between me and Mrs. Miller. I swear." He studied me for a long moment, his eyes boring into mine as if trying to read my thoughts. "Perhaps," he finally said, "but I'm not sure I believe you, and I can't take that chance. In that moment, I knew I was in real danger. This man, whoever he was capable of terrible things, and he saw me as a threat. I had to get out of there. Without warning, I lunged to the side, trying to dodge past him. But he was faster than I expected. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he growled, all pretense of friendliness gone. I struggled against his grip, panic giving me strength. We grappled for a moment, knocking into the kitchen island. The bags of food toppled to the floor, containers spilling open and spreading their contents across the pristine tile. In the chaos, I managed to break free. I sprinted for the front door, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear him giving chase, his footsteps thundering on the hardwood floors. I reached the door, my hands scrabbling at the lock. It seemed to take an eternity, but finally it clicked open. I yanked the door open and burst out into the night air. My motorcycle was still there, thank God. I leaped on, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life just as the man appeared in the doorway. "This isn't over," he shouted as I peeled away from the curb. "I'll find you." I rode like the wind, taking random turns and backtracking, paranoid that he might be following me. It wasn't until I was miles away in a completely different part of the city that I finally allowed myself to slow down. My hands were shaking as I pulled over to the side of the road. I took deep, gulping breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. What the hell had just happened? I knew I should call the police, report what had occurred. But would they believe me? And what about the Millers? Were they really in danger, or was this all some kind of sick game? As I sat there trying to decide what to do, my phone buzzed. A new delivery request. For a moment I considered ignoring it, considered quitting this job altogether, but then I thought about the man's words. "I'll find you." Maybe the best thing to do was to act normal, to go about my routine as if nothing had happened, at least until I could figure out what to do next. With shaking hands, I accepted the new order. As I pulled back onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had irrevocably changed, that somewhere out there a dangerous man was watching, waiting, and I had no idea what he would do next. Story 15. The glint of chrome caught my eye first. A sleek sedan, its hood up, steam billowing into the crisp morning air. But it wasn't the car that made my pulse quicken. It was the man standing beside it, his eyes darting nervously as I pulled my patrol car onto the shoulder. 15 years on, the force teaches you to trust your gut, and right now mine was screaming that something was very, very wrong. I'm Officer Sarah Reeves, Highway Patrol. And this seemingly routine stop was about to become the most harrowing encounter of my career. I radioed in my location before stepping out of the cruiser, one hand resting casually on my holster. Standard procedure, but today it felt different, more necessary. "Having some car trouble, sir," I called out, approaching with measured steps. The man turned, plastering on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mid-30s, well-dressed, but with a sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cool weather. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, officer," he said, his voice a touch too high. "I think it's just overheated. I was hoping someone would stop." I nodded, keeping my tone light. "Let's take a look, shall we? Pop the hood for me." As he leaned into the car, I caught a glimpse of the interior. Nothing overtly suspicious, but something about the way the back seat was arranged nagged at me, a blanket thrown haphazardly as if covering something. "Sir, could you step back from the vehicle for me?" I said, my hand moving closer to my weapon. He hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Just a precaution," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Could I see your license and registration, please?" He nodded, reaching slowly for his back pocket. That's when I saw it. The edge of what looked like a zip tie peeking out from his jacket sleeve. My training kicked in. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands where I can see them." His facade crumbled. In a flash, he lunged for the open car door. I drew my weapon, muscle memory taking over. "Freeze! Don't move!" But he was already diving into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life. Apparently, it hadn't been broken down at all. I had seconds to make a decision. I aimed for the tires, squeezing off 2 shots in rapid succession. The rear tire exploded, sending the car fishtailing across the highway. It spun once, twice, before slamming into the guardrail with a sickening crunch of metal. Heart pounding, I approached the smoking wreck, gun trained on the driver's side door. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands up." For a moment, nothing. Then slowly the door creaked open. The man stumbled out, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. But it wasn't him I was focused on. It was the muffled sounds coming from the back seat. "On the ground now," I barked, keeping my gun trained on him as I edged toward the rear door. He complied, sinking to his knees with a defeated look. With one hand still on my weapon, I yanked open the back door. The blanket I'd noticed earlier had shifted in the crash, revealing a young woman bound and gagged in the footwell. Her eyes were wide with terror, tears streaking her face. "It's okay," I said softly, holstering my weapon to free her. "You're safe now. I'm Officer Reeves. Can you tell me your name?" As I worked on the restraints, she managed to choke out, "Emily. Emily Larson." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Emily Larson had been all over the news for the past 48 hours, a college student who'd vanished from a gas station on her way home for spring break. I keyed my radio, my voice tight with urgency. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reeves. I need immediate backup and paramedics to my location. I have a 1095 in custody and I've located Emily Larson. Repeat, Emily Larson is safe and in my custody." The radio crackled with responses, but I was focused on Emily. As I helped her from the car, her legs buckled. I caught her, easing her to sit on the ground. "It's over," I murmured, draping my jacket around her shoulders. "You're going home." She broke down then, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. I held her, my own eyes stinging with unshed tears. This job hardens you in many ways, but moments like these, they remind you why you do it. The wail of approaching sirens filled the air. As I waited for backup to arrive, I kept one eye on our suspect, still prone on the ground, and the other on Emily. The adrenaline was starting to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a growing sense of what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. Within minutes, the lonely stretch of highway was transformed into a hive of activity. State troopers, local police, FBI agents, word travels fast when it comes to a high-profile kidnapping. I gave my statement more times than I could count, each retelling making the events seem more surreal. As they loaded the suspect, now identified as Marcus Grable, a man with a history of stalking charges, into a police van, I caught his eye. There was no remorse there, only cold calculation. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how close he'd come to getting away with it. Hours later, as the sun began to set, I found myself sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped around my shoulders. Emily had been taken to the hospital for evaluation, reunited with her frantic parents. The crime scene techs were still combing over every inch of Grable's car. My sergeant, a gruff veteran named Mike Callahan, ambled over. "Hell of a day, Reeves," he said, handing me a cup of coffee. I took it gratefully, the warmth seeping into my chilled hands. "Yeah," I managed, my voice hoarse from repeating my story. He sat down beside me, his bulk making the ambulance dip slightly. "You did good out there, trusted your gut, made the right calls. Not everyone would have picked up on those little details." I nodded, too drained to form a proper response. The weight of what had almost happened, what I'd prevented, was starting to settle in. "Listen," Callahan continued, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "I know this kind of thing can mess with your head. There's no shame in talking to someone about it. Department's got resources if you need them." I looked up at him, surprised by the offer. Callahan wasn't known for his soft touch. "Thanks, Sarge. I'll keep that in mind." He clapped me on the shoulder, nearly spilling my coffee. "Take a few days off, get your head straight, but when you come back—" He paused, a hint of a smile tugging at his weathered face. "Well, let's just say the brass is mighty impressed. You might be looking at a commendation out of this." As he walked away, I let his words sink in. A commendation. It should have felt good, validating. But all I could think about was Emily's terrified face, the cold look in Grable's eyes, the what-ifs that would likely haunt my dreams for weeks to come. I stood up, stretching muscles stiff from hours of tension. The crime scene was winding down now, the flashing lights of police cars replaced by the steady glow of floodlights as the techs continued their meticulous work. Walking to the edge of the road, I looked out over the darkening landscape. Somewhere out there, Emily Larson was safe in a hospital bed surrounded by her loved ones, and Marcus Grable was in a cell, his plans thwarted. All because I'd noticed a glint of chrome and trusted my instincts. As I headed back to my cruiser, ready to finally call it a day, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This job wasn't easy. It came with long hours, danger, and the kind of stress that could eat away at you if you let it. But days like today, they made it all worth it. I slid behind the wheel, taking a moment to center myself before starting the engine. Tomorrow would bring paperwork, debriefings, and probably a fair bit of media attention. But tonight I'd go home knowing I'd made a difference, knowing that because I was here doing this job, a young woman would see her family again. As I pulled onto the highway, the last streaks of sunlight fading from the sky, I allowed myself a small smile. Just another day on the job for a highway patrol officer, but one I'd never forget.